Good afternoon, colleagues. I hope everybody is suitably refreshed after that delicious lunch. I particularly enjoyed the profiteroles, and I'm very pleased to welcome Ken Muir, who is the CEO of the General Teaching Council for Scotland, and he's going to be speaking to us for a little while this afternoon, and then afterwards we have a few questions. So over to you.
Thanks, Ewan. Thanks for the invitation to address you this afternoon. Can I maybe begin by saying that I agreed with almost all of what Ewan said in his presidential address this morning, but as a geography teacher, can I maybe just remind folk that Ordnance Survey paper maps are not dead? And I was going to propose a motion to that effect, but I've been asked to talk about the work of GTCS, but particularly the development of a national e-portfolio, otherwise known as my professional learning, and I will pick up on that in the course of my input. I also want to pick up on a couple of themes that the President referenced in his address, because they're very pertinent to the General Teaching Council for Scotland as well. I mean, one of the questions that was asked is, why is it so hard to recruit teachers? I want to develop that a wee bit in my own presentation and say something about the role of GTCS and what we're trying to do in order to support more teachers into the profession. What was also interesting was Ewan's comment about the importance of networks and collaboration within the system. And I like to quote, "We are all of us." And I know that GTC Scotland sometimes is seen as operating in a bit of a parallel universe. Very much on the periphery of things, not necessarily seen as being a key player within the education system. And very often registrants asking me, what is it I get for my 50 quid a year, which is considerably less than what you pay for your SSTA membership, I have to remind you. Sorry, was that a sore point? Sorry. But also I would accord with what Ewan said about GTCS. It is not perfect, but what I hope to be able to show to you today is that it is changing, and it is trying to change and align with the pressures that are in the system, the pressures that are facing all of you as practitioners, and the pressures that are facing the system more generally within Scotland. And what you also said about not assuming that people know what we are about is very much where GTCS is at the moment. So, very much the perception of GTCS is set out in that first slide. Many practitioners see GTCS, as I say, operating in a bit of a parallel universe, and not an awful lot of clarity about what it is we do to support the profession. And you'll notice that I've included right at the middle the professional associations, because clearly you do play a very important role in effecting change and improvement. You'll notice that I've also included local authorities in it, but I did wonder as I was preparing this slide as to whether, with the recent pronouncements from government and the possible ways forward, and I'm looking at John Butcher sitting in the back chair as Director of Education in North Ayrshire, whether the local authorities might not be more appropriately positioned as that kind of half moon somewhere on the periphery of the system in the future. Sorry, don't want to be too controversial, but most of you probably see GTCS in this context here. You know, we are the baddies that remove teachers either because of incompetence or because of misconduct from the register. On average, we remove about 30 folk from the register a year. The vast majority of those are misconduct. Last year we removed, I think it was 27, and were 3 of those for incompetence. It is a very small proportion of the teaching workforce that are subject to our fitness to teach requirements. But fitness to teach is only part of what we do. And as I say, where I've tried to position GTCS, and I know my predecessor Tony Finn did likewise, is very much part of that collaborative network or partnership working to try and support the education system in Scotland as a whole. Traditionally, General Teaching Council has been seen as being a two-legged stool. It's been one where it has been the body that registers teachers, and we have a very proud tradition in Scotland of only registering those teachers who satisfy the academic requirements and the teaching qualification requirements, and very much seen as a regulatory body as well. I would put it to you that in the last 5 years, and certainly in the last couple of years, and looking to the future as we prepare our next strategic plan, looking over the next 5 years, that third leg of professional learning is one that the General Teaching Council has already begun to take steps towards developing, and one that's likely to figure even more prominently. And I've picked out a couple of quotes there from Graham Donaldson's report about the importance that GTCS should ensure that those involved in front line in schools are ready for that task. That was very much a clarion call to GTCS to be more involved in professional learning. And interestingly, from a professional association's point of view, the OECD report that was referred to earlier on this morning, a cry for the teachers' unions and GTCS to take on a greater role in providing and synchronising professional learning provision. So we're very much up for that, and very much up for working in partnership with all of the professional associations and trying to drive that agenda. Coming back to me selling GTCS to you, unfortunately as registered teachers you don't have an option. You have to disperse your 50 quid to us every year, but we have about 73,500 registrants. But it's not just teachers that we register. It's important to realise that there are a number of college lecturers, and one of the places that we're trying to move forward is to encourage a greater number of college lecturers to be registered with us at a time when the senior phase in secondary schools increasingly are using college lecturers in schools and youngsters are attending college. As the main guarantor of the quality within the education system in Scotland, I often get asked by parents and parent groups, can you guarantee that those lecturers who are delivering in the senior phase in my particular school or a particular school are subject to the same registration and regulation that classroom teachers are? Now, the answer to that currently, of course, is no. So we're making a very strong plea for college lecturers to become more registered with us. And it's also a requirement for any lecturer who is part of one of the 8 initial teacher education universities delivering the training for those teachers who are coming into the profession also to be registered with us. What's interesting is that we're beginning to embark on registration of other than teachers, and the first group that is up for that are instrumental music instructors. There are about 750 in Scotland, and there has been a plea from them, not from us, but from them, to be registered. Now, we know that they're not teachers, they're a different salary scale and so on, but very much keen to ensure that we protect the integrity of the profession, of whom instrumental music instructors are part of that profession. And it is interesting looking at the developments that have been happening in Wales with an eye to what might happen in Scotland. The Education Workforce Council was introduced to replace the General Teaching Council in Wales just in April last year. And there's a mandatory requirement on the registration, not just of teachers there, but of college lecturers, of pupil support assistants in schools, of PSAs in colleges, and from April 2017, all youth workers being registered with that body. So we're looking to other jurisdictions to see what straws might be in the wind for the likes of ourselves. And there is a myth that somehow or other the GTC in Scotland doesn't register teachers from out with Scotland, and particularly from England. You'll see there that in the last 4 years we have registered over 1,000 teachers from England. Where we haven't registered them, it's been where they've come through the initial Teach First programme, where they do not have a teaching qualification. But most of those Teach First students who are coming from England now do have a recognised teaching qualification through an accredited programme at one of the universities. So Teach First, of course, is very much in the news at the moment. I think it's important that all of you as delegates understand that there are some Teach First teachers that we have not registered, and there are some that we have, because they have got a teaching qualification, maintaining that high standard that's required. And we also, for your information there, in the last 4 years have registered almost 600 overseas teachers. One of the big influences on GTC in the last year has been the Education Bill, which has made a requirement, very belatedly in my view it has to be said, that all teachers working in the independent sector and in grant-aided special schools are also registered with GTCS. And That in itself has presented a few difficulties, a few problems, and one or two of the political pronouncements along the lines of oil workers suddenly transferring to become teachers has caused a degree of consternation for the General Teaching Council's council and for myself personally. But one of the things that we have tried to do is, in moving with the times, is to create more flexibility in the routes into becoming a fully registered teacher in Scotland. And that bottom left-hand corner headline, which was in the Sun, really disappointed me because it occurred on page 4 as opposed to what I had hoped for on page 3. So what are some of the developments that I think you as delegates of a professional association need to be aware of? We introduced provisional conditional registration as a means by which we could try and address some of the shortages in teaching that we know exist out there, particularly for teachers who are qualified and who are experienced from England but don't have a teaching qualification. What we have introduced is provisional conditional registration that allows them effectively to go into a probationary period within Scotland, subject to them getting a top-up PGDE programme accredited by either a Scottish university or an English university. We've also introduced standard for registration equivalence tests which allow us to assess through a professional interview those teachers who are coming from England to satisfy ourselves that they meet the standard for full registration in Scotland. And critically, and it was touched on in one of the discussions this morning around the first motion, about the supply of teachers into Scotland. There have been a couple of years now where universities have not been able to attract the number of youngsters who have got potential places within university programmes. We have an issue in attracting potential teachers through the traditional routes of a 4-year programme or a 1-year postgraduate programme. We need to look at more creative and innovative ways in which folk can come into the teaching profession from other routes by folk who have been in a career and who are wishing to transfer into teaching. And one of the challenges for us just now in GTC Scotland is to try and work with the initial teacher education universities, encouraging them and persuading them to offer programmes for folk who wish to take a career change or who wish to come back into teaching as returnees to teaching. One of the advantages that we've had since the new order that gave us independence in 2012 is that we can create categories of registration beyond those traditional categories of registration. And one of the things that we're looking at in the context of the Education Bill, in order to try and attract and to register teachers in the independent sector so that they are subject to registration and subject to regulation, is to look at possible categories that might restrict them to teaching in a particular school or teaching in the independent sector itself. And one of the things, again, looking at moving with the times, we all know the broad general education presents its challenges, not least in delivering it, but also presents GTCS with its challenges, and that teachers are now teaching up to what could be the equivalent of the 4th curriculum level by the end of S3, and particularly in those subjects where it's a single teacher teaching a rota. And we're looking at the possibility of creating some kind of combined primary-secondary qualification in order to try and address some of the challenges that provides us with. And I know for a fact that when teachers, and it doesn't happen for those in Scotland because the process is very straightforward, but for getting registration sufficiently early enough so that schools aren't left with classes without teachers, is to try and improve our registration process, and we've already got moves afoot to try and make our registration process much slicker and much faster. This is an advert that I took from a newspaper south of the border about 1.5 years ago, and it's asking or advertising for an unqualified teacher. Now, one of the reasons why GTCS was set up in 1965 in Scotland was to do away with unqualified teachers. And we cannot have, and we need to stand together to ensure that unqualified teachers do not come into the teaching profession in Scotland. It's a challenge, however, because at the same time I have directors of education, I have parents, I have head teachers saying to me, I cannot get a teacher, and I've had a class that's gone without a teacher, I cannot get a supply teacher. So one of the challenges for GTCS is offering increased flexibility in routes into teaching and through full registration with GTCS, but at the same time maintaining the high quality that is expected of the teaching profession in Scotland. It's something that we all hold very dear to. Turning to regulation, and I know it's a difficult subject sometimes, and the vast majority of teachers in Scotland never come anywhere near GTCS because they're not subject to our regulatory functions. But it is important to note from our order that we have a statutory right and a requirement to investigate any fitness to teach of individuals who are either planning to become teachers or who are teachers. And it's also important to recognise that we operate as a regulator in the public interest. And that's an important insurance for all of us in the profession, that what is required are high standards of the profession. And one of the things that I say to folk when they question me about paying their £50 a year, their paltry £50 a year, is that it is a guarantee to allow me and colleagues within GTCS to be able to stand up and to say to parents that they should have confidence in the profession, that teachers are highly professional, are highly skilled and highly able to deal with the complexities of teaching. So as a regulator, we must operate in the public interest. I want to say something very briefly, and I'm not expecting you necessarily to see all of this on the screen, but the fitness to teach process is one that I am trying to change, and it's one which has already begun to change. There are 3 processes involved in taking a teacher through a fitness to teach case. The first process is a screening process that happens internally within GTCS, and it's simply to screen out those complaints that are frivolous, malicious or vexatious. And we get quite a few of them, and quite a few are screened out at that particular point. The second stage is to investigate any complaint. And at the end of that process, there is an independent panel made up of a majority of registered teachers who decide whether there is a fitness to teach case to be answered. And the third process, and I've had to split this diagram into 3, is that fitness to teach process. And the end product of that can be a number of things. It can certainly be removal. It could be no further action. It could be a removal with consent. There could be various other outcomes from a fitness to teach panel. There could be a condition laid on a teacher. Particularly, we find that necessary where there has been misconduct in the areas of misuse of drugs or alcoholism. The condition might be that they undertake a programme to alleviate that and to resolve that. From number 1 to number 3 can take the best part of a year and a half. And I know, and having spoken to Seamus and senior officials at SSTA, sometimes that can be much too long for teachers who are subject to a complaint. What we're trying to do is to streamline that process as much as possible, whilst at the same time acknowledging we have a public duty to be robust in our fitness to teach process. What we're trying to do very much is to streamline those as much as possible. And as I'm saying in this slide, streamlining the processes in order to conclude those cases more quickly. It's not in my interest, it's not in your interest as members of the profession, and it's certainly not in the interest of the teacher involved to have that process being extended any more than it needs to. So coming back to the notion that GTCS plays a role in that networking, and it is one of the features of Scottish education, I think, worldwide, that we are very, very much an integrated profession, that the various bodies, in spite of what's been said about SQ earlier on, that we are able to talk to each other, and generally we can arrive at a degree of consensus around direction of travel and how things need to change. And I think that has been the case, albeit perhaps not quickly enough, with some of the issues that have arisen in the assessment and the qualifications. I've left on your tables, sorry. Apologies. Well, I won't apologise for it, but I actually started life as a baker and then became a teacher, but I still always consider myself to be a teacher. I've left the wee Z card, the wee concertina thing that opens up, which was an attempt by me and by colleagues at GTCS to show you what it is you get for your 50 quid, because as I said, most of you don't engage directly with GTCS, but we're doing a lot of work behind the scenes for you. So what are we doing to support professional learning? We have the setting of the professional standards, and again, by way of an update, these have been in place for 5 years. As of January next year, we are looking to review the professional standards for teachers. We're just in the form of a drafting of the professional standards for instructors, because they are not teachers. But we're looking to review those, and we will review those in conjunction with all the partners who appeared on that previous slide. And the professional associations and SSTA will be part of all of that. We also operate the teacher induction scheme, which is the mechanism whereby you get, in the main, high quality probationers coming through the system and into your schools. It is GTCS that oversees that on behalf of the Scottish Government. We operate a professional recognition scheme. And again, these awards are offered to individual teachers. They're offered to organisations that offer professional learning opportunities that are a sufficiently high quality. And again, most teachers I speak to are unaware of these professional recognition awards, and one of the things that I'm keen to do is to use them much more as a catalyst for teachers to engage in professional inquiry and work collaboratively within their schools and across clusters and professional learning communities. We make available over 1,700 pieces of academic research through EBSCO, which is an online facility that's free to all registrants, as well as a range of e-books. And we're just doing some work just now through the appointment of a new Senior Education Officer, National Improvement Framework, to prepare packages of CPD that teachers can use in their own time or use during professional learning time in order to enhance their skills and their understanding. We operate the student placement scheme. Imperfect though it may be, but one of the ways in which you get students into your schools, into your departments, is through the work of GTCS operating this national scheme. And of course we manage professional update. And I know that there's still a way to go in convincing teachers that professional update is a good thing, but if you think about the range of youngsters who are coming through your schools, and think of them 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, and think of what changes you've seen in that time and what you're likely to experience over your career in the next 5 to 10 years, then the question that I always ask is, what is it and who is it that's preparing teachers to deliver on those changes and to deal with those changes? And professional update is designed to be part of the infrastructure that creates an entitlement for all teachers to have their professional learning needs both recognised and met. And professional update, again, is a way in which I, as a representative of the profession in Scotland as a whole, can say to ministers and can say to parents and the public at large, this is a high quality professional learning profession that we have in Scotland. And of course we have the Teaching Scotland magazine, which we've changed dramatically, and I don't know how many of you open the cellophane wrapper and actually read it, or indeed even read it from cover to cover. It's probably somewhere between 30 and 50% of teachers in Scotland. I'm not going to embarrass myself or embarrass you by taking a poll here, but I sometimes do at these events. But I would simply urge you to, if you haven't looked at it recently, we're trying very hard to make it a magazine that is perhaps a bit more sparky, a bit more controversial, and brings the range of perspectives that teachers are giving us on particular themes and topics, which with each of the individual copies having a specific theme. And the most recent one on the right hand side there, which should have been delivered to you in the course of the last week or so, with its health and well-being theme, has got some wonderful articles in it. And I want to finish just by talking about this national e-portfolio, because when Seamus asked me to address you today, he wanted me to major on this. Professional learning is with us. It always has been, arguably. But as I said, professional update perhaps brings an added element of focus to teachers' professional learning, both being recognised and being delivered upon. And the National Improvement Board that existed up until a year or so ago, and Scottish Government commissioned the General Teaching Council for Scotland to carry out a feasibility study into the possibility of having a national e-portfolio, a single portal through which teachers could both log their professional learning and access professional learning opportunities. And a study was undertaken. We sought views across the board from teachers, from local authorities, from professional associations, as to whether this was desirable, and if it was desirable, how best it might work. And what came out of that scoping exercise were a number of findings. One, that there was a very inconsistent approach to recording teachers' professional learning and actually accessing it across authorities. Or some authorities that were using My GTCS, the majority of them. There were some were using Sopra, there were some using Gateway, there were some using very hand-knitted paper-based versions, and I'm sure they're all represented still within the forum today. That they were having a significant impact on teachers, and that really what we needed was a system that allowed teachers to take their professional learning wherever it was they worked in Scotland, and Scottish Government particularly keen that we look to a national system. Not only one that logged professional learning and provided the facility to log professional learning, which is what all these systems plus My GTCS does, but also to look at accessing professional learning and evaluating professional learning. So basically there was strong support from 26 of the local authorities around this notion of creating a national e-portfolio. And there was very little resistance to it, although quite rightly there were questions asked about how it would work in operation. And what came through the scoping was that such a system would be portable, it would be transferable, it would allow a standard, that a measuring or a benchmarking against the professional standards for all of the purposes of self-evaluation, that it would link directly to My GTCS, which, as I say, almost 62,000 teachers in Scotland are now using out of the 73,500. And it would allow to link in with professional learning and create a kind of enhanced tool for professional learning and professional update. So the decision was taken to house it around the existing system of My GTCS, and a group was set up, including the professional associations, including ADES, Scottish Government and all the key players, as to what a system might look like. There are a number of general principles agreed. It would allow teachers to document their professional learning, as I say, and record the outcomes of their activity. It would be something that would be accessible not just through My GTCS, but it would also be accessible through GLOW, because there was a question asked about was there not a national e-portfolio already there. It would also be accessible through the other systems, through Sopra, through Gateway and so on. But over time what it would do was create a national system and actually replace and save some money for the local authorities in terms of the systems that they used. As I said, it would follow teachers irrespective of where they went, a bit like what My GTCS attempts to do. And it would have a number of safeguards built into it that would ensure that it's secure and visible only to the individual teacher and with permission to others, such as your line manager and so on. And one of the other advantages of it would do away with the double entry system that some authorities still require, that professional learning is logged on the existing system and it's also logged on My GTCS. And it would allow teachers, as it said there, to transfer and receive data from other systems like Sopra and Gateway. And it would allow a search facility for teachers to look at professional learning opportunities that were available to them. So a number of principles that were agreed. The important thing, I think, for all of you is to know that we are running a pilot of My Professional Learning starting this August. We've gone out to a number of local authorities, to a number of colleges, to individual schools to find out whether they would be wish to be involved in the pilot. We've got about 6 or 7 authorities lined up, a couple of schools from the independent sector, some lecturers from the university sector, and also a couple of colleges been asked to undertake a piloting of this, which involves them in no more than logging their professional learning through My GTCS as part of this trial national e-portfolio. So what I've tried to do today is both to set out what GTCS does for you and other colleagues and members within SSTA, what it is you get for your 50 quid a year, and particularly what it is that's coming round the corner in terms of the national e-portfolio. I think it's always important to emphasise that if we are talking about change in a system, and we're very much at the point where we have change in the Scottish system, arguably too much change. But it's important to remember that all of you and all of the colleagues that are in the profession are the ones that make the biggest difference. It's very glib and easy to say that teachers are important. Of course they are. But we know from John Hattie's research the worldwide research, largest piece of research into what makes for the most effective change and improvement in an education system, that there are two things. Teachers make the difference. But the second thing also, and the surprising part from John's research, as he says himself, is that one of the biggest effects on learner outcomes at a time when we are thinking about closing the attainment gap and all the other things that are in the system just now, that the other thing that is equally important is when teachers become learners of their own teaching. So in other words, when teachers reflect on their practice and engage meaningfully in professional learning. And I know that in the current climate sometimes that isn't easy, but hopefully you'll understand from what I've said today that GTCS is very much part of that and very much part of trying to support the system, not just through being a very effective regulator. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ken, for that very interesting talk. Ken's very kindly agreed to answer a few questions as well from members. And I think we're ready with the roving mics. I'll maybe start with the first question from Catherine Nicholl.
Thank you, President. I would like to ask Ken to slightly expand on what he's been talking about procedurally wise for the e-portfolios. My question is, in what ways will replacing professional update, e-portfolios and use of My GTCS with single point system, My Professional Learning, benefit teachers?
I don't think we're replacing professional update, first of all, Catherine. I mean, certainly what we're looking to do with the National e-portfolio is to replace the range of systems that are there just now, and that in itself can be confusing for teachers, in that if they're moving across local authorities, then moving from one system to another and getting used to that system is certainly an issue and adding to the complexity. And it's, as I said in my presentation, it really is about trying to build as much as possible on what has been seen by many to be a very effective system, My GTCS. Again, it hasn't been without its odd glitch, but having a standardised system that both allows the recording of professional learning, but the e-portfolio also providing the single portal through which teachers can access professional learning opportunities, a bit like the CPD Find that was at one time run through the National CPD organisation. Having all of that in a single place should, and I'm sure absolutely will, reduce some of the frantic activity that teachers find themselves engaging in trying to find professional learning opportunities, what kinds of provisioners are out there, what sort of courses are there out there, if we can afford to go on them. Having it all in a single portal is very much what is key to the kind of rationale of having a single system. It's not going to happen overnight, but what's reassuring from my point of view, as I say, is that we've got 62,500 out of 73,500 teachers already using My GTCS. It's a development of that, and having it in a single place I think will save a lot of confusion and a lot of wasted time.
Thank you very much. We've got another question from Sandra Richardson.
Hi there, good afternoon. Well, Mr. Muir, I'd like my 50 quid's worth, perhaps in your answer. It's a two-parter question. Would you be willing to outline the GTCS stance on the performance of the SQA over the new qualifications? That's part A. And part B is, could you outline the GTCS support for the teachers' concerns over the quality of the materials produced by the SQA and the incumbent additional workload on teachers? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sandra. As the person who chaired the group that produced the two reflections reports over the last 2 years, I think I would probably take a neutral, I'll give you a neutral response to the stance, because part of my role was to try and be neutral, recognising that on the one hand I had professional associations baying for the blood of SQA and sitting around the same table were SQA themselves. So I certainly recognise the difficulties that there have been, and I think it would be unfair to say that GTCS and its council had a stance on it. I mean, we certainly have a view that the system, and I said it in the report, of assessment and qualifications is much too complex, and the first year and indeed the second year has demanded an unacceptably high resource, if I can put an input from teachers themselves. I think in terms of the second part, the quality of the materials that SQA produced, I mean, for all of us having been part of the learning profession, we're actually not very good learners. If you go back, and standard grade was referred to the days of O-levels, not that we've ever had them in Scotland, but O-grades and such like. If we go back a generation, and it is 30 years since standard grade, introduced in 1985, what did we do the first year after standard grade was introduced? We completely redesigned the assessment arrangements. When we introduced the new higher still in the early 2000s, what did we do? First year after the introduction of the new higher still qualifications, we had review groups set up to look again at the demands that were in place, that were being placed on teachers and students with regard to the assessment requirements. And my view is that we actually haven't learnt the lessons of those major curriculum changes. And I was speaking to one or two colleagues of yours at lunchtime. I mean, I think we've actually got the mechanism for designing the qualifications and the assessment arrangements wrong in Scotland. I think far too often in the past, and it's happened with standard grade, it happened with higher still, we're seeing it again with curriculum for excellence. What has driven the change in the course arrangements has been the examination and the qualifications. That has been the driver. Whereas what we should be doing, I think, is looking at the curriculum and what is required as agreed by experts, practitioners in the subject areas, what is required by way of knowledge, understanding, skills, attitudes, dispositions within the course arrangements, and saying to the likes of SQA, these are the key things that then need to be assessed. Now go and design the assessments and the examination system around that. The advantage of doing it that way around, as opposed to what we've had for the last generation in Scotland, where the only time we really think about course arrangements and curriculum change is when the examinations change. What that would give us is much greater focus on the importance of learning and teaching, the importance of curriculum, and then designing a qualifications and examination system that meets the needs of that. And I think we've still got that the wrong way around in Scotland. So, as I say, I don't think we learnt the lessons, to be quite honest, from previous major curriculum and qualifications change in Scotland. I think we also didn't, and it's easy to say this with hindsight, but I don't think, irrespective of SQA's best efforts, and I don't think anybody set out to make the system as complex as it did. That came through very, very strongly in the work that I chaired for the 2 reflections reports. Nobody sat down and said, let's make this as bloody awkward as possible for teachers and youngsters. Absolutely not. I think the groups that were brought together were doing it with the very best of intentions. They were subject-specific groups, as you might expect. The bit that we missed out was looking at the cumulative impact and the cumulative effect of such a radical change, both on teachers and in terms of the assessment demands and the qualification demands, and on the youngsters themselves. So it's very easy to say that with hindsight. I know that SQA have given commitments. They are already working. They have already made changes to some of the course arrangements and so on. I think the reality is, and the recommendations that will come out from Alistair Allen's group will pretty much, and I haven't seen them, but I would pretty much imagine they're not a million miles away from what my group came out with in the 2 reports that we published. They cannot simply turn taps on and off. I think we're going to have to accept that there will be some things that could be done to alleviate some of the pressures in the short term. And I think a move away from the system of internal assessments, where you can get 90% in an internal assessment and still fail it, is just crazy. But I think what SQA are looking to do to try and set threshold scores is a much better way forward. And I think there will be iterative change, but I think it will take a year or 2 until we get a system that is much more bedded in and much more acceptable to the profession.
Thank you very much. We've got a third question from Alan Johnson.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Why should teachers fund the National Improvement Framework post which the GTCS recently advertised?
Sorry, say that again, Alan.
Why should teachers fund the National Improvement framework post which the GTCS recently advertised?
All right, okay, the Senior Education Officer National Improvement Framework. There's a very simple answer to that, Alan, and registrants are not funding it. It's been funded by Scottish Government. And one of the reasons I asked Scottish Government to fund it was because if you look at the 6 drivers within the National Improvement Framework, teacher professionalism is quite rightly a key driver. Given what I said about John Hattie's findings, it's a critical driver if we're going to be serious about closing the attainment gap. And I, like you, Alan, felt that it wasn't appropriate that GTC and registrants should fund that post. In fairness to Scottish Government, they have come up with the money to fund that post entirely for the 2 years of its existence.
Thank you very much. We've got a fourth question from Stuart Hunter.
Hi Ken, again thanks. You alluded earlier to the role of probationers in the GTCS and also with regard to recruitment and retention. On that account, my question would be, are the GTCS prepared to give greater clarification on expectations of probationers in relation to workload to avoid them being exploited in the name of making their CV looking better to increase their chances of a permanent contract?
It's a good question, Stuart, and I mean I'm not going to stand here and say that probationers are not being exploited. I know that in some schools and indeed perhaps in 1 or 2 authorities that is possibly happening. Well, it is happening, and I think some of it is a balance between what's been expected by faculty heads or perhaps by head teachers on the probationers themselves. Sometimes it's the probationers themselves taking on far more than they actually should. There's a very clear arrangement as part of the contract that we have with schools and authorities that 0.82 of the time should be in class, should be teaching, and that the mentoring time should be given over to the rest of the week. Now, we play a role in both ensuring that the probationers are in the system, but we also play a role in monitoring what is happening out there with regard to schools and local authorities meeting the needs, meeting the letter of the contract. I have got 5 senior education officers doing that, covering the entirety of Scotland, and I'm not making an excuse for it. There's a limited amount that we can do to monitor it. What I would say, and by way of giving you as delegates reassurance, if we do find that there are situations like that, and sometimes it's the probationers themselves who come to us, and we've had one particular example in the last sort of 3 or 4 months where we've had to go to the local authority and say, what you are asking of probationers is not within the terms of the contract, and you need to desist from taking that approach to probationers. But I'm dependent on all of you as well as the probationers themselves making sure that that contract is adhered to the letter. As I say, sometimes the problem are the probationers themselves wishing to put on a good show, if you like, and taking on far more than they themselves are required to take on. And we spend a lot of time, my senior education officers spend a lot of time talking to probationers before they go into their posts and through the actual teacher education programme itself. So all I would say is that we're aware that it can be an issue. It pops up from time to time. If you and colleagues within SSTA feel that it's something that should be brought to our attention, then we have a role in monitoring the contract and we do so.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time just for one last question from James Howe.
Ken, I would like to stay on probationers. Probationers come with an element of support. Now, the support runs to 0.1% of a timetable or 2.25 hours a week. Most mentors in schools are receiving 50 minutes per week to support mentors. Now that equates to 10 minutes a day to provide them with quality support. Now I couldn't make a cup of tea and give you a tissue in those 10 minutes. Can you tell me what the GTCS are going to do to ensure mentors are given sufficient time to support probationers during the probationary year?
I suppose in many ways, James, my answer is similar to the one that I gave to Stuart. There is a contract there, and the Scottish Government spend £50 million a year on the teacher induction scheme. There's a contract drawn up with each of the local authorities in terms of what is required of mentors, and there's a very clear statement in it about the amount of time that should be allocated to a mentor. If that isn't happening again, we pick up on it occasionally. I can do no more than respond to the kind of comments that come in. And as I say, in fairness, it's fairly infrequent, I have to say, but if there are schools that are not, and local authorities that are not abiding by that particular teacher induction scheme contract, then we need to know about it, because the money is in the system for local authorities and for schools to provide the amount of cover that's required for mentors to fully fulfil what it is it's required of them. I would agree it would be great if it could be a half timetable, it would be great if it could be more than it currently is, but that is what has been negotiated just now, and if we're looking to make any changes to that, then we need to make that, we need to take that approach to Scottish Government. But I would say the teacher induction scheme is one. I mean, we had a group from, believe it or not, Zimbabwe yesterday within Clarewood House who are looking to establish a teaching council in Zimbabwe, and they were picking our brains for the day on what was appropriate and what was an appropriate way to go around setting up a teaching council. And the teacher induction scheme was something that they saw as being, a kind of almost a jewel in the crown of the Scottish education system. And when you think of what's happening in other jurisdictions, and reference has been made already today in what's happening south of the border, it might not be a perfect scheme, the teacher induction scheme, and there might be overly zealous practitioners in the system that end up giving themselves an awful lot more work than they need to, and there might be issues in terms of mentors getting the amount of time, but it's a far, far better system than what we've ever had in the past. It's been going for 13 years now, and it's a hell of a lot better than many other teachers get as part of their introduction to this wonderful profession.
Well, thank you very much for coming today, Ken. It's been very useful to hear about the GTCS, which of course affects all of us. So, as I said, thank you very much indeed for taking time today to come and speak to us. I've just got a little gift for you here as well.